Hi, my name is Zach Huffman with Pocket Coach Academy, and in this video, we're going to break down the 2025-2026 policy debate resolution. We're going to explore the key issues and give you a foundational understanding of the arguments that you're going to be hearing and making this debate season. The topic itself is resolved. The United States federal government should significantly increase its exploration and/or development of the Arctic. So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with deconstructing some key terms of the resolution. Then we're going to look at the current state of affairs in the Arctic. And then we're going to dive into the major problem areas that affirmative teams are going to focus on and the negative strategies that'll counter those affirmative arguments. And then finally, we're just going to kind of synthesize the ideas and understand the core debates at the heart of this topic. So, first up, we have to deconstruct the term the United States federal government. This is our actor of the resolution. It specifies that the plan must be enacted by the central government in Washington, D.C. This means an affirmative team will propose a policy carried out by an entity like the Department of Defense, the Department of the Interior, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, otherwise known as NOAA or NOAA. For the negative, this opens up arguments that other actors like the state of Alaska, a different coalition of international partners, private corporations that might be better suited to act, and those would be called agent counterplans. So next, we're going to look into the terms significantly increase. This is all about the scale of the action that the affirmative plan will be making. It can't just be a minor tweak to existing policy. It needs to represent a substantial and a meaningful change from what is currently going on in the Arctic. This is going to be a critical point of debate. The affirmative will argue that their plan is a bold new direction, while the neg will contend that it's not significant enough to solve these problems it identifies, or that the current level of activity is already on the rise. They could also argue that the affirmative's increase is too significant, which often is what leads to links on disadvantages. Next, we're going to go over exploration and or development. Um, Exploration is about searching and discovering. This could be scientific expeditions to study climate change, mapping the uncharted Arctic seabed, or looking for new mineral and energy resources. Development, on the other hand, is about putting those resources in that area to use. This could mean building new deep water ports, constructing military bases, surveillance systems, extracting oil and natural gas, or establishing new shipping lanes between continents. The phrase and or is extremely crucial here. It gives affirmative teams the flexibility to focus their plan on just exploration, just development, or a combination of both, which is going to be a key strategic decision for your affirmative because it determines how negative teams are going to link their arguments to the affirmative. So if you choose just development, it's going to be difficult for a negative team to read their dissad that is about exploration, which is why this and or is such a critical point of contention. So next, we're going to look into the Arctic, the terminology of the Arctic itself and what it really is defined as. Geographically, it is usually understood as the area north of the Arctic Circle. Politically, it would encompass the territories of the eight Arctic nations, like the United States, Canada, Russia, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. There are also some states that claim themselves to be near Arctic states, such as China. Affirmative plans are going to need to be very specific about where in the Arctic they are acting. This could also be point of contention in topicality debates, where the negative might argue that the affirmative plan is not actually in the Arctic definitionally. It might take place somewhere like China, which might be a near Arctic state, and that's going to be a huge point of contention of if that is actually the Arctic or if it's not, which is why defining that key term is so significant. Negative teams should also bring up counter plans that focus on other parts of the Arctic. For example, if the affirmative might say we're going to increase icebreaker development in Alaska, a negative counterplan might say that it should happen in Greenland instead. And that's why that terminology is so important. So that's to understand the arguments that we're going to be talking about, we kind of need to understand the status quo or the present situation of the Arctic right now. Um, I would say that the Arctic is a region in transition. There's increased influence in there. There's increased development already from other countries, and the Arctic is not going to be the same region it was 10 years from now, the region it is 10 years from now. The most significant driver of this transition is climate change. Rapidly melting sea ice is opening up new waterways, making previous resources that were inaccessible, more accessible. This has also triggered a new era of geopolitical competition. Russia has been heavily militarizing its Arctic coastline. China, declaring itself as a near Arctic state, is also making significant economic and scientific exploration or developments into the Arctic. The United States has a more limited presence, but it is growing. Um, there are immense economic interests at play in the Arctic, vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and critical rare earth materials. Um, Not to mention that there is also a huge human element in the Arctic, as it's homeland to numerous indigenous peoples whose culture and livelihoods are intrinsically linked to the changing environment. So, some recent developments that have happened in the Arctic. It's become a focal point for strategic competition among the United States, Russia, and China due to the climate change-induced ice melting, which has opened up these new opportunities, like we mentioned earlier. This could open up opportunities for shipping routes, military presence, and resource extraction. There are some significant developments that have occurred recently. For example, the United States in 2024 released a Arctic strategy document, which boosts its military presence and also forms the Ice Pact with Canada and Finland, which is its purpose is to counter Russia and China's influence in the Arctic. For example, Russia is expanding Arctic bases, developing the Northern Sea Route with China, and advancing more energy projects into oil and natural gas reserves in the region. And China's Polar Silk Road initiative involves heavy investment in that Russian Arctic infrastructure with joint military exercises along with it, as well as joint scientific expeditions, which raise concerns in the United States about the growing role of China and Russia in their cooperation, as the United States views China and Russia's growing cooperation as a threat to regional stability and its national security, particularly due to the joint military exercises and economic alignment. However, some analysts argue that the United States overemphasizes China's role given Russia's dominant position, whereas China is more supporting Russia instead of cooperating with Russia on these goals. And while they may be cooperating economically and militarily, there is still some tension between Russia and China in the Arctic, as Russia has historically resisted Chinese involvement and because they have differences in governance approaches, as China views the Arctic region as more as a multilateral point of influence where it can bring in multiple different actors from multiple different continents, whereas Russia is viewing it as a more unilateral expansion as they want to increase their own influence for their own interests in a more unilateral way and less cooperative with other countries. But because Russia is so economically dependent on China, it kind of just wants to have China's, I guess, blessing to do this unilateral action. So that's kind of what's going on in the Arctic right now. That has caused a lot of um, geopolitical concerns and growing tensions in the region. So, you know, going further in that, one affirmative problem area that we could look at is geopolitical competition. So, why would the United States significantly increase its presence? One specific area would be geopolitical competition. The argument here is that the Arctic is becoming a theater for a new Cold War. Russia's military buildup and China's expanding influence threaten United States interests and the stability in the region. So, one affirmative plan might propose increasing U.S. military patrols, building new icebreaker ships, enhancing surveillance capabilities to deter potential aggression, and maintain a balance of power. These are going to be key advantages about deterring conflict and protecting the freedom of navigation for the United States. And the affirmative team is going to argue that by doing these actions, it would decrease the risk of a war developing, of a physical war developing from this new Cold War with Russia and China in the Arctic. Another key area of contention is going to be economic opportunity. The argument is that the United States is at risk of being left behind in the race for the Arctic's immense resources, As ice melts and new shipping routes are opening up, it could drastically cut transit times between Asia, Europe, and North America. So, an affirmative case in this area might advocate for federal investment in the infrastructure needed for resource extraction, like ports and pipelines, or for the development of these new shipping lanes. The advantages would be a boost to the United States economy, more energy independence, and securing supply chains for minerals that are vital for modern technology. For example, one of the biggest and growing impact areas is obviously climate change. Some minerals that are in the Arctic right now are key to the development of climate change technology, otherwise known as green technology, which is also going to be a huge point of emphasis on affirmative teams, which we're about to get into here. As a third affirmative problem area could be climate change and scientific research. They'll argue that what happens in the Arctic doesn't necessarily stay in the Arctic, right? The dramatic changes in the resources there have global consequences. And since there are rising sea levels right now in the Arctic, that could also disrupt weather patterns and cause extreme climate change. Just because the ice is melting and there's new shipping routes, et cetera, doesn't mean that the ice melting is good, as it could also disrupt a lot of the ocean's ecosystem as well as weather patterns. So an affirmative plan might propose a massive increase in funding for scientific exploration, which could allow for better climate modeling, improve disaster preparedness, and just a better understanding of the ecosystem in the Arctic. And the advantage is that this research would be good and or essential for confronting the global climate crisis. So now we can get into some negative areas on this topic. So let's turn to the disadvantages. For this topic, you can expect to hear about environmental devastation. Increased activity could lead to oil spills, pollution, the destruction of specific habitats. Another common disadvantage will be the geopolitical escalation, like a United States military buildup could be seen as a provocative move by Russia and China, which could spark an arms race and make conflict more likely and not less likely, which should create an opportunity for a case turn. Other disadvantages could focus on the economic costs of operating the Arctic and maybe the social costs of operating of resource extraction. Um, Disadvantages on this topic are going to rely heavily on the specific region that the affirmative is arguing in, as well as the specific action, whether it's exploration and development. I think a lot of disads are going to be focused on United States military buildup, so you need to be prepared to answer that if you're running a buildup case. Those will be the strongest disads because those are going to have links to provoking Russia and China. Another key area for disadvantages is going to be the economic cost of it. For example, there are going to be a lot of political disads that argue that spending on this new development or exploration of the Arctic could lead to political horse trading, could lead to some bills being passed or some bills not being passed. It could lead to increased political capital for the president, or it might not, which is why disadvantages on this topic are going to be such a, I think there's going to be a huge variety. It's not going to be like other topics where there are very specific disads that apply to the core of the topic, and there aren't very many outside of that. I think this topic is going to have so many disads and so many different disad areas based on the breadth of the topic area and how much flexibility the topic is given to affirmatives. And that flexibility also translates to the negative side, which is why there's going to be so many disads. Let's look at counterplans. I think a typical counterplan you're going to see on this topic is going to be an agent counterplan. So working through international bodies like the Arctic Council to foster cooperation, or a negative team might suggest that private companies or the state of Alaska are better equipped to handle economic development. Um, Other popular counterplans are likely going to involve diplomatic or economic sanctions to counter Russia and Chinese influence, arguing that this is a less risky approach than military expansion or increased United States influence in the region. Because if you think about it, a lot of the affirmatives that are going to be on this topic, their goal isn't necessarily to increase expansion in the Arctic, but rather to decrease Russian or Chinese influence in the Arctic by expanding the United States influence. So if you can get to the major points of contention on the affirmative and say that there are other ways to prevent Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic region, then those counterplans are going to be popular, and that's going to be like using economic or diplomatic sanctions in order to do so. So some popular critiques that are going to be on this topic, like always, the capitalism critique. It's going to argue that their focus on resource extraction is just another example of commodification of nature and exploiting people. A securitization critique would argue that framing the Arctic as a security threat or just this whole area as an arena of war creates and influences the conditions of conflict more than the actual actions themselves. And then another critique would be the anthropocentrism critique, which challenges the human-centered worldview of the affirmative, arguing that the intrinsic value of the Arctic is not in the human use of it, but rather of the environment itself and protecting the value and the rights of the environment in the Arctic itself. I think that the strongest K on this topic will either be the cap K, because that's always going to be a huge K on every topic, but the settler colonialism critique, due to the expansion of U.S. interests into lands that remain outside of colonial spheres of influence. The Inuit people, the Yupik, the Aleut, the Sami, among other groups, still maintain indigenous culture and ways of life in relationship to the land. And I think a good settler colonialism critique is very, very, I would say, it's kind of OP on this topic, because there it's basically the perfect topic for a settler colonialism critique, due to the fact that it's the United States expanding into a land that it previously was not in, where people are in that land and the land is kind of outside of colonial spheres of influence, meaning that's kind of been untouched by Western influence. There are indigenous groups in Alaska, and Greenland, and extreme northern Canada that are kind of outside of the typical spheres of influence of the United States or just other forms of governance, of Western governance. So I think a good settler colonialism critique could argue that the expansion into those indigenous lands or indigenous ways of life could further the 500-year-long genocide of native life in North America that began with the arrival of Columbus. I think that is probably going to be one of the strongest critiques on this topic, due to the fact that the topic itself lends a lot to the settler colonialism critique and its links, and just its overall theory of how the world operates. Because if they can prove that the United States is expanding due to colonial reasons, due whether that be resource extraction, whether that be preventing war, that's just a huge, huge, huge boost for the negative, which is why honestly, I think that this topic is probably going to lean more towards the negative side than the affirmative side, just due to the breadth of this topic, that allows for the negative to have a lot more flexibility. So this has been the PCA topic lecture on the upcoming 2025-2026 policy debate topic, which is resolved. The United States federal government should significantly increase its exploration and/or development of the Arctic. So this has been Pocket Coach Academy, giving you the 2025-2026 policy debate topic lecture, and I hope you tune in for other videos.